Arieto, but there's nothing that translates Arieto, which is an Italian first name, so it sounded a lot like Harry to people, so they started calling him Harry. Harry Bertoia, from the time he was a child, was very well known for his artistic abilities. In a small village in Italy, the young brides would approach him when he was a boy for him to design their wedding embroidery patterns for their linens. So he started out very young. So he came from the Venice area, and then he came to America. And when he came to America, he really came only so that he could visit his brother, who was here. But once he got here, he studied art and design, and he learned the art of jewelry making, and this led to sculptural designs. But what we have upstairs, obviously, is an ink drawing that he has done. So I'm going to show you how this all kind of unfolds, and that's why I really wanted you to be here, because if you only see that upstairs, you won't get the idea of how he got to that painting that we're going to see upstairs. When he came here, after his schooling, he went to work with Ray and Charles Ames. Remember them from when we did the Herman Miller? Remember when Charles and Ray came up with that chair that they won the Museum of Modern Art Award for with the molded plywood? Well, believe it or not, at that time, Harry was working with them. And when he was working with them, Sheridan and Ames, Charles Ames, came up with that design for the chair. And we're going to advance ourselves here so you can remember the chair.
Is it on? Is it green? Let me see.
Oh.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, that's
That's
me.
okay.
That's you.
There it is.
Top. Okay. That's the chair that we're talking about. Okay? All right. This is the chair that Sheridan and Ames won the the Museum of Modern Art Award. But part of this furniture award was that it was supposed to be affordable to mass produce. The problem was it wasn't affordable to be mass produced. But eventually it was because of Harry Bertoia. Harry Bertoia came up with the idea. And Ames took that idea, used it, and never gave Harry any credit. So at that point, he leaves the company. And believe me, he wasn't just on par with them as a worker. He actually designed Ray and Charles Ames' wedding bands because he was a jewelry maker at the time. So he was a friend of the family. And as a matter of fact, he was also working in the research department with Charles Ames, and he was working on making airplane parts during the war for a war effort, and he still came up with a solution for him and got no credit for it. So frustrated, as you can imagine, he left the company. And when he left the company, there was another furniture making group, the Knoll. Have you ever heard of Knoll Furniture? You can go on the internet and you can still find their work. The Knoll Furniture Company was a husband and wife kind of team that headed up this company. They offered Harry Bertoia the chance to come and work with them, and they said, you have free reign. You can come here and you can create furniture, you can create jewelry, you can create sculpture, you can do whatever you want, because they knew of his great talent. So, I'm going backwards here. There we go. This is what he came up with. Are any of you familiar with this chair? This is the diamond chair. This is Harry Bertoia's chair. The diamond chair. Well, they're thrilled with this. It's a series of 5 pieces total. But this is the one that was really catching on. As soon as they were about to put it out in the market, the Herman Miller Company sues Harry Bertoia because he was using 2 little metal wires that came up onto the side to connect the legs to the seat, which he was the one who actually created when he was with Charles and Ray Ames working for the Herman Miller Company. So he just went back to the drawing board, came up with a different kind of wire connection. Then he was fine. He could put this out on the market, and it made so much money that he could actually leave furniture making and just go into what he was interested in, which was creating sculpture that created music. He was so involved with this that he actually used to put on concerts with symphonies, and he had 10 albums that were out with his music that was created from his sculpture. And one of the reasons I really wanted you to see this is when you see his artwork upstairs. Let me see if I can bring it back to where. It's such a hard time. Oh, wow. Do you know this? This is Harry Bertoya's too. It's called the Dandelion. And there are all these iron rods that go into this sort of center. And during the World's Fair, the Kodak building had them all in the front of. They had Harry Bertoya create these, and they had it all in the front of their building, and people fell in love with it. Harry Bertoya, sadly, died of lung cancer, and the reason was because of the toxic fumes he was inhaling from all of these sculptures. He particularly liked materials that had beryllium in it. This was his copper work, and because of that, it contributed to his lung cancer. But when he was diagnosed with his cancer, he put his affairs in order, so he organized his life's work, and he had produced more than 50,000 pieces. Okay, so within a short life, he died at 63 years old. He actually had created many pieces. What we're going to see upstairs is not obviously a piece of sculpture nor any of his furniture, but when you see the piece that he does, you're going to see that it reflects the look of his sculpture. So that it's called quadrilaterals. When you go upstairs and you see that piece, I want you to remember that piece of sculpture. Okay, the next person we're going to talk about is here we go. Jimmy Ernst. Now, all of you have heard of Max Ernst. Oh, he's the son of Max Ernst. And he's also the son of Louise Strauss. Louise Strauss was married to Max Ernst. Now, she was a well-known art historian and a journalist, but his parents were divorced in 1922, and his father moves to France. Jimmy stays with his mother. All right, so he stays with his mother. In February of 1933, a month after Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany, Louise's apartment is searched by the SS because she's a Jewish woman who is a scholar. They immediately interpret her as a suspect of the regime. So to keep Jimmy safe, they send Jimmy from Germany, they send him to stay with his grandparents, and Louise goes to France. Now in the meantime, Jimmy immigrates to New York City. They send Jimmy to New York City in 1938. So he escapes World War II, and here he meets with a lot of European exiles and the city's avant-garde that are also located most generally in New York City. In 1940, he petitions the Emergency Rescue Committee, which was called the ERC, here in the United States to secure the release of his father, who was in internment at that point. Now, during the 1940s, he becomes a member of the Irascible 18, and it's a group of abstract painters who protest against the Metropolitan Museum of Art's policy towards the American paintings in the 1940s. And I have a copy of this letter that he writes that all the artists of that time, the 18 artists, signed, and I'm going to share it with you because I think it's pretty amazing. To be held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art next December and will not submit work to its jury. The organization of the exhibition and the choice of the jurors by Francis Henry Taylor and Robert Beverly Hale, the Metropolitan's director and the associate curator of America's art, does not warrant any hope that a just proportion of advanced art will be included. We draw to the attention of those gentlemen in historical fact that for roughly 100 years, only advanced art has made any consequential contribution to civilization. Mr. Taylor, on more than one occasion, has publicly declared his contempt for modern painting. Mr. Hale, in accepting a jury notorious for this hostile act to advanced art, takes his place beside Mr. Taylor. We believe that all the advanced artists of America will join us in our stand. Jimmy Ernst wrote this letter. He was the first one on the list. But the others who had their name also part of this was Alfred Gottlieb, Robert Motherwell, William Bezoitz, who we also have upstairs. You've all heard of Theodore Stamos we have upstairs. Jackson Pollock, he was on this list. Mark Rothko, who was also part of Root's collection, not part of our show, but also another person that he collected. William DeCooney. I mean, the list goes on. There's 18 artists who put their names down. And then there were also 10 sculptors who also put their names down. This is, remember when we talked about Root, and we said that at one point when his brother was the vice president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that Root lent all his collection to the Metropolitan Museum. It was one of the first times they did that, and that it was a win-win situation because the Metropolitan Museum of Art had such a bad reputation for ignoring advanced art and the kind of art that Root was collecting. You can see how all of those pieces to the puzzle start to fall together. And Jimmy Ernst was one of the leaders of this irascible 18. And you can see that many of the people that are represented upstairs were also a part of that group. Now here's what happens. In 1941, Max Ernst is released and he arrives in New York City from Nazi-occupied France. Unbeknownst to his son Jimmy, in 1944, his mother was sent to Auschwitz and she didn't survive. So as you can tell, Jimmy has a look at the world that's going to make him look at it as we started to talk about why people went towards abstract expressionism. That they had more to talk about what they felt inside, their psychological scars, the psychological problems. Root felt that a drawing no longer had to be traced that was left by a hand. He knew that it was supposed to be something that was supposed to come from inside. He didn't necessarily understand it right away. There wasn't even a language to talk about it initially. People who were probably the center of the art world, art critics, art gallery owners, people who collected art. This new art didn't even have a language. And believe it or not, it was Edward Root at Hamilton College who even offered a course on how to talk about modern art and gave people a language to talk and critique and to understand it better. So Jimmy was one of the people who was really the catalyst on making the Metropolitan say, telling them, we're not going to even try to be part of your jury show because we know we're going to get rejected. And it was Edward Root who ends up having all of their work submitted as a guest show that becomes really a gemstone of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and takes away that terrible title that they have of being, rejecting something that was contemporary. To be held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art next December and will not submit work to its jury. The organization of the exhibition and the choice of the jurors by Francis Henry Taylor and Robert Beverly Hale, the Metropolitan's director and the associate curator of America's art, does not warrant any hope that a just proportion of advanced art will be included. We draw to the attention of those gentlemen in historical fact that for roughly 100 years, only advanced art has made any consequential contribution to civilization. Mr. Taylor, on more than one occasion, has publicly declared his contempt for modern painting. Mr. Hale, in accepting a jury notorious for this hostile act to advanced art, takes his place beside Mr. Taylor. We believe that all the advanced artists of America will join us in our stand. Jimmy Ernst wrote this letter. He was the first one on the list. But the others who had their name also part of this was Alfred Gottlieb, Robert Motherwell, William Bezoitz, who we also have upstairs. You've all heard of Theodore Stamos we have upstairs. Jackson Pollock, he was on this list. Mark Rothko, who was also part of Root's collection, not part of our show, but also another person that he collected. William DeCooney, I mean, the list goes on. There's 18 artists who put their names down. And then there were also 10 sculptors who also put their names down. This is, remember when we talked about Root, and we said that at one point when his brother was the vice president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that Root lent all his collection to the Metropolitan Museum. It was one of the first times they did that, and that it was a win-win situation because the Metropolitan Museum of Art had such a bad reputation for ignoring advanced art and the kind of art that Root was collecting. you can see how all of those pieces to the puzzle start to fall together. And Jimmy Ernst was one of the leaders of this irascible 18. And you can see that many of the people that are represented upstairs were also a part of that group. Now here's what happens. In 1941, Master Ernst is released, and he arrives in New York City from Nazi-occupied France. Unbeknownst to his son Jimmy, in 1944, his mother was sent to Auschwitz, and she didn't survive. So, as you can tell, Jimmy has a look at the world that's going to make him look at it as we started to talk about why people went towards abstract expressionism. That they had more to talk about what they felt inside, their psychological scars, the psychological problems. Root felt that a drawing no longer had to be traced that was left by a hand. He knew that it was supposed to be something that was supposed to come from inside. He didn't necessarily understand it right away. There wasn't even a language to talk about it initially. People who were probably the center of the art world, art critics, art gallery owners, people who collected art. This new art didn't even have a language. And believe it or not, it was Edward Root at Hamilton College who even offered a course on how to talk about modern art and gave people a language to talk and critique and to understand it better. So Jimmy was one of the people who was really the catalyst of making the Metropolitan say, telling them, we're not going to even try to be part of your jury show because we know we're going to get rejected. And it was Edward Root who ends up having all of their work submitted as a guest show that becomes really a gemstone of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and takes away that terrible title that they have of being, rejecting something that was contemporary. Okay, the next person I want to talk to you about is Arshil Gorky. And his piece is called Making the Calendar. And when we see this upstairs, it is so hard for me not to just want to stand there and cry because it is the most heartfelt piece I think I've ever seen in abstract expressions. And what you have to understand is where Gorky came from. First of all, his name was not Arshil Gorky. His name was Vastanik Manuk Adwin. He was born in a small Armenian town. And in 1908, his father immigrates to America to avoid the draft. He leaves his family behind. I want you to see Arshil and his mother. There's a photograph of him and his mother, and that's one of his paintings as a young boy. That's himself with his mother. In 1915, Gorky flees the country. He's 11 years old during the Armenian genocide. And they escape, his three sisters, his mother, and himself, escape to the Russian-controlled territory. And as a result of this genocide, his mother dies in his arms of starvation. So Gorky arrives in America when he's 16 years old and is reunited with his father, and as you can imagine, this was quite a strained relationship. In the process of reinventing himself, he changes his name to Arshil Gorky. He tells people that he's even claiming some noble Georgian background and that he may be a relative to Maxim Gorky, who was a Russian writer. He changes his birth date on a number of occasions as well. Do you see the importance of the name of the piece upstairs? Do you remember what the name of the piece was?
Making the calendar.
The Making of the Calendar. Okay, here's a quote from him. And I think, Karen Convertino, who's a registrar here, I think all of you know her. When she was my student, as many of you probably know. And I remember when she used to come home from college and visit, and I used to say, so what area of art history are you, really concentrating in? And she said, contemporary. Because if I want to know something about painting, I just call the artist. And I thought, what a brilliant idea. Because otherwise, we're just getting fact that isn't always fact. And we're always getting someone's interpretation of what somebody said. But when you have a quote from an artist, I think it's so important to share it, because this is when you truly know what that artist is thinking. This is a quote from Archie. The stuff of thought is the seed of the artist. Dreams form the bristles of the artist's brush. As the eye functions as the brain sentry, I communicate my innermost perceptions through art, my worldview. The pain that this man went through as a child did not go away once he came here. He marries the daughter of Admiral Magruder. Her name is Agnes, in 1941. In 1946, Gorky suffers a series of crises. His studio barn burns down. He had a colostomy for cancer, and Agnes has an affair. In 1948, his neck was broken, and his painting arm was temporarily paralyzed in a car accident. Agnes leaves him, taking the children with him. So the painting that we're going to see upstairs was painted during this time. In 1948, at the age of 44, Gorky hangs himself. So when you see that painting upstairs called Making the Calendar, I want you to remember that Gorky created beauty out of tragedy. And here was yet another quote. Abstraction allows man to see with his mind what he cannot physically see with his eyes. Abstract art enables the artist to perceive beyond the tangible. He continues to say, you extract the infinite out of the finite. It is the emancipation of the mind. It is an explosion into unknown areas. And the very last quote that I think really, really says what that painting is upstairs. He says, art must always remain earnest. Art must be serious, no sarcasm, comedy. One does not laugh at a loved one. And so when you go upstairs and see these blotches of color and sort of symbols of things that are not realistic, think of his background, think of his pain, and think of the time in which he painted this. And it all becomes very real, and it really is a message to us that comes from inside, not just a portrait of him as well. Okay, the next one that I, the next one I really want to see is Jackson Pollock. He was born in Cody, Wyoming in 1912. He grew up in Arizona and Colorado. He got expelled from two different high schools. So finally his father says, just come with me. He's a surveyor, and so he takes him around and he explores the Native American culture while he's on surveying trips with his father. He moves to New York City in 1930. He struggles with alcoholism. I think all of us are pretty familiar with that problem. He's trying to deal with his alcoholism between the years of 1938 and 42, and this is when he undergoes the psychotherapy called Jungian. I think we've heard of that before. This therapy includes encouraging Pollock to make drawings. And in many cases, people feel that the drawings he made through this psychotherapy was the sort of the kickoff to his abstract expressionist kinds of paintings that he eventually develops. Now, he's regarded as reclusive, volatile, but recently historians are starting to say that they think he was bipolar. So in 1945, he marries Lee Krasner, and she is an artist as well. This is her work, not that much different from what we saw from Jackson Pollock. Okay, she becomes an important influence on his career and his legacy. They moved to East Hampton on Long Island, and Peggy Guggenheim, who is now the wife and the stepmother of Jimmy Ernst. She's married to Max Ernst. Jimmy Ernst is her stepson. Peggy Guggenheim actually helps Lee and Jackson buy their home. She actually lends them the money so that they can buy their home. Pollock converts the barn into a studio, and this is where he is said to have perfected his big drip technique, which he becomes permanently identified with. He dies at 44 in an alcohol-related single-car accident, and he was driving. But the reason I felt it was so important to see this together is because of this. I want to introduce you to Janet Solo. Jackson Pollock says, new needs need new techniques, and modern artists have found new ways and new means of making their statements. Each age finds its own technique. Drip painting was first introduced to the art world by Janet Solo, not Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock did not make a drip painting until 3 years after Janet Sobel had her work on display at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery. Janet Sobel was a Ukrainian-American artist. In 1944, roughly 3 years before Jackson Pollock, she exhibited her drip painting work at Peggy Guggenheim's The Art of the Century gallery. Jackson Pollock, with the critic Clement Greenberg, saw her work for the first time in 1946 at Peggy Guggenheim's exhibit. In his essay, in this art critic's essay, and he called his essay American Type Painting, Greenberg notes those works by Janet Sobel, and look, she's talking to Eleanor Roosevelt, so she wasn't some woman that no one knew about, okay? They were the first of all overpainting he had ever seen, and he puts this in his essay, and said that Pollock admitted that these pictures had made an impression on him. In 1947, Jackson Pollock produced his first drip painting. That was 3 years after Janet Sobel. Sobel clearly had a moment. I'm reading a quote from an essay called Female. Sobel clearly had a moment and really broke through in ways that other artists hadn't yet done. Pollock gets all the glory, and Pollock was a great painter, there's no question. But if his greatness is partially dependent on his breakthrough with drip painting, well, he didn't do it alone, and he didn't necessarily get there first. Unfortunately, Sobel did not receive recognition for this influence for many years. After moving to upstate New York in 1946, she began producing fewer and fewer works until her career as an artist faded away. Only in the past 20 years or so has her body of work begun to garner the attention of the art world again. But let me tell you, I searched and searched for this woman's work. There's not even a title to any of her pieces. And people who try to talk to you about her don't even spell her name right. People keep spelling S-O-B-O-L, S-O-B-E-L. She's still, sadly, forgotten. These are her paintings. And I couldn't go upstairs. I swear to you, I know that upstairs is what you're going to talk about. But I could not perpetuate the way women artists have just been pushed to the back. You have to at least know about it. And I think that you know yourself that the Robineau room upstairs, the gallery upstairs, is a direct statement about this very thing. That feminism show that we have is saying we've got to stop this. Now, not every piece of artwork painted by a woman is feminism art. It's a woman who painted during a time. And what I believe one of the biggest injustice is when we even open an art history book that's written rather recently, we'll still find that the woman is mentioned in a little blue box someplace within an art period. I noticed that when I was picking up these textbooks for my classes when I was teaching art history for college credit. That women were still they were an anomaly. They weren't part of the art world. And we have to be at least aware that they were, and they should be, and we have to vote for that. We have to make it, I have to share this with you, or I'm just perpetuating the same kind of lack of exposure. So I apologize if I've taken you away from upstairs for a little while, but I think overall, I think it's a gift to all of us to know about these women. Now here's Jackson again. Once again, look at how Jackson was also part of the 18, the Irascible 18. You're going to see his paintings upstairs. Why do I want you to see him? Was because he's a Greek-American artist. He held down many jobs. One of them was he owned a frame company. He owned a frame shop. And he framed a lot of pieces that are upstairs because a lot of our artists went to him to have their framing done. He was one of the very youngest painters of that original group of the Irascibles, and I'll give you a quick look at them. There they are. Those are those Irascibles. You can see Jackson Pollock in the middle. You see Theodoros towards the front. Those are the Irascible 18 who stood up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and said, "We are not going to have you judge our work. You are not qualified. You do not respect who we are, and we are your future." One of the other things I really wanted you to know about Theodoros is that he was probably more well known in the art world because of a major lawsuit. So I wanted you to know about this. And the reason is because of how, once again, it relates to our wonderful Mr. Root. Mr. Root, this is one of the second largest collections that Edward Root makes. Do you know how he's at Birchfield? He collected him for 20 years. He also collected Stamos' work for many years. He has many pieces by Stamos. If Root didn't have those and didn't keep putting those out there, remember how he gave them a lot of opportunity to be exhibited because he would lend his exhibits? He would have been forgotten because of something that happened. It was called the Rothko case. All of you are familiar with Mark Rothko, the painter. Okay. It was a major lawsuit and a scandal in the art world. Rothko chose Stamos to be the executor of his estate. A little over a year after Rothko commits suicide in 1970, Rothko's daughter sues the estate executors as well as the Marlborough Gallery for waste and fraud. Now here's what happens. There's over 12 years of litigation and appeals, and it reveals that many of Rothko's paintings, which had been sold or consigned by his estate, was being sold and consigned through the Marlborough Gallery in Manhattan. They were sold at intentionally deflated prices to favored clients, while the gallery was taking an inflated high 50% off of it. Now, this compared to typically of any artist of that stature would have been 30%. Rothko, this was unbeknownst to Rothko. Rothko just left Stamos as his executor because they were friends. Stamos, in the meantime, had his own gallery. He wasn't with the Marlborough Gallery. He had his own gallery, but Marlborough, he gives him a very handsome contract to come and have his work with them. So he leaves his gallery, he goes to the Marlborough Gallery, and they keep giving him these large commissions off of the sales for Rothko's work. In the long run, he joins into the conspiracy, he switches all his representation there, and the defendants are found guilty and are fined over $9 million. Stamos has to pay his share of the fine by signing over his house to the Rothko estate, but he's granted the tenancy for the rest of his life. But this case does a lot to promote Rothko because he becomes the center of interest, but it does a lot to damage Stamos' reputation. As a result, the gallery, the Marlborough Gallery, won't represent him anymore, and none of the top galleries will now. So as a result, the lack of a top gallery support gave collectors a lesser sense of security regarding the value of his work, and his work wasn't selling. So if it wasn't for Root collecting his work, believing in him, and keeping his work out there every time he would have these exhibits that he would put places, there's a good chance that this man would have been forgotten too. Or at least only remembered from the scandal. These are some more of his works. He goes through different stages, and you can see the changes in his. Mark Toby. Now this is one that I think that you'll really enjoy when you see it in person. It's hard to see here, but when you see this upstairs, Mark Toby was self-taught. And he was a poet, he was a composer, and a self-taught painter. He converts to a religion called Baha'ism. And it's a Persian belief, and it made a great impact on his life. He becomes interested also in Cubism, in the East Asian artwork. He particularly liked the work of the Native Americans, the Tlingit and also the Haida, which were Native Americans of Alaska, and also Zen painting. He travels to Japan, he travels to China, and he brings all of these thoughts back together again. And that's when he comes up with this idea called white writing. And once again, the sort of all-over surface kind of work, brushwork, becomes something that they give credit to Jackson Pollock for in the future for coming up with. But it was Mark Toby who came up with white writing. This was the first time that this was ever exhibited. Now he covers, how he creates this is that he covers his picture plane with white or light-colored calligraphic symbols on an abstract field that's composed of thousands of small and interwoven brushstrokes. And you're going to see some of that symbolic work overlaid on things that are more representational when we see his work upstairs. One of the things he gives rise to is that overall painting, like I said. Now, here's a quote from Toby. When asked about painting, he sums up by saying, "If you can sign your name to moonlight, that's the thing." And that's exactly what you see when you see his work. This idea that if you could just bring the light to what is out there, then that's the most beautiful thing you can give people. Now, the other artist that we're going to see is Bolotowski. When you go up there, I just want you to always remember the work of Mondrian, a Dutch painter who was his mentor. So the principles of neoclassicism is definitely something that we're going to see in Bolotowski's work. We see that restricted palette of mostly primary colors, but one of the things I think that you'll notice that Bolotowski takes it almost a step away. It's not like he copies the idea. He keeps his palette pretty simplified, but he also makes it more of a composition. It's not all just vertical and horizontal line work. He works with diagonals and shapes that gives you more information. Another artist we're going to take a look at is Arthur Dove. He grew up loving the outdoors, and this was one of the reasons Root loved his work, because he had such a love for nature. As a young boy, Arthur's neighbor was a naturalist, and not only that, he was a painter. So he spent a lot of time with his neighbor, and he heard all about nature. He discovered a lot of wonderful things about nature, and on top of it, he was given scrap pieces of canvas from his neighbor so he could paint. So from a young child, he was really dedicated to this idea of abstraction, but yet also to the idea of nature. What he calls his work are extractions, that he extracts essential forms out of a scene from nature. Now, Dove exhibited his work at the Stieglitz Gallery. I know all of us know about Stieglitz, married to George O'Keeffe, so you can see his kind of crowd that he would have known. He was the very first to publicly exhibit abstract work by an American artist. And in 2 years after that first exhibit, Dove became a leader in international art development. Dove's work can be seen as a bridge linking American modernists and the group of younger artists that Root collected during the last decade of his life. Root was deeply moved by his work simply because of the nature and the background that he always loved in terms of nature. Now I want to show you something about extractionism. Do you see this piece called Tree? When I had it on my screensaver, when I had it like on my desktop on my computer, you can imagine it's probably not even as the size of half of a stamp, okay? And without my glasses on, I was looking for this because I wanted to pop it up and look at it. This was a picture of my husband turning hot dogs in the backyard of his school. And I popped this picture up because when that was the size of half of a stamp, without my glasses on, look at the colors. Talk about extraction. This is exactly what extraction is. It's looking at a very realistic world, but then just extracting the colors, the shapes. Do you see what I'm saying? Obviously, Arthur did not stand and watch my husband make those hot dogs for his students, but when I saw how I had confused those two images, it made perfect sense of how to try to explain this to you. After doing all this research and looking at all these pieces of artwork, as I'm driving down the street, I started noticing myself looking at the side of the building with a fire hydrant in front of it with the black mold kind of crawling up with some cracks in it, and I'm sitting there going, that red is a nice balance to the black, and I'm making this into a composition, and that is exactly what I think you as docents, as educators of the public and as children that come in here, that's exactly what you want them to leave with. They're not going to go home and hang any of these over their bed. They may not be able to even explain these kinds of things to other people. They don't have the language yet. But if they start to see the world like this, you help them take a step further in the development of art, in the development of seeing the world. Because remember, this abstraction came out of the ugliness of war, the ugliness of reproducing a world that could have atomic bombs and internment camps and death camps and the horrible things that these men and women experienced. They started to talk and create from what was inside, what they felt. and they used the world around them as a jumping off point, and then they used their psychology and extracted what they needed from life to create what they were trying to tell people. Yes.
You're saying the word extraction.
Yes, extracting.
Okay, because it's so close.
Yes, abstract, but it's extraction. And then, thank you for bringing up the word. Chuck helped me out last time. I kept making reference to synchronism, when the word was not synchronism, and I even have it written wrong in my notes. It's synchronism, because synchronism is the harmonies in music, and that's what synchronism is, the harmonies of music being blended into the ideas of how color is working together. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's the same idea, because that's what synchronism is, using the same ideas and the same thought patterns about how music can be blended in certain ways to make a composition and different values of sound. And synchronism was a style that some artists were using that we're going to see upstairs that used color of different values in different tones to create harmonies to make a composition. So the word is synchronism when you speak of the art, not synchronism, which is the music. And I believe we're ready to go upstairs. Here with his new figures, the stateliness of the woman, the way she's standing with it, how it echoes almost the tree. You know what I'm saying? So she almost becomes part of her landscape, the way she stands. Prendergast. Now here's the piece that locks the deal for everyone. When he goes to the armory show and he sees Duchamp's work, you descending the staircase, when he sees Matisse's work, he becomes enamored by this new kind of art that comes from Europe, it comes here and now is on display in New York City. But he finds it's his patriotic duty to buy American painters' work, not something that came from someplace else. And so what he does is he goes and he sees Prendergast pieces, and he buys the most expensive of Prendergast. If you take a look at Prendergast's work, is really, believe me, he was part of the Ashcan school. He was part of the eight. He was a firm believer in no jury, no prizes. He wanted to show the same kind of philosophy. He believed in the philosophy and the mission of the eight in the Ashcan school. But his technique was far more post-impressionist. His technique was not the grittiness of New York City. His technique was, I mean, you take a look at George Lucas, and then you take a look at Prendergast, you would swear that they came from two different places. They couldn't possibly be coming from the same philosophy. But they had the same ideas, what was right and what was just and what was good for the art world, but his approach was different. His had almost the feeling of a mosaic, kind of a sparkling Jew mosaic, using those sort of damp brushstrokes that we often associate with pointillism, being more of a Seurat kind of a look. Another thing he does is with his coloration, which is much more post-impressionistic. Take a look at the women's dress. This is one of Everson's pieces, as well as one of Chalice. So those two, I'm sure you've got background in those pieces because of knowing the permanent collection here. I'm going to refer to George Luke's piece, Luxembourg Gardens. This is called the read-in frame. And this is where you can see where he's still kind of holding on to the look of, maybe the gold is a little bit there, but the read-in look kind of starts to take you away from that feeling of France. Although this scene could be any little walk that you saw in France. It looks like something that could have happened, a little oil sketch that was in Paris. Again, those impressionistic kinds of touches. Again, saying you don't need pinks, you don't need those colors, you need darks, you need lights, and you can create volume. Root studies, drawing, and painting, don't forget, with George Lucas. He spends a lot of time with George, and George does a lot of suggesting as to what he should collect, what he should collect. So they are very good friends, and the artwork that you see up here will, in fact, reflect a lot of the taste of George Lucas as well, because of his association with Root while he was making his collections. One of the things that George Lucas
says is he says, why should an American home be full of English portraits when you should encourage American art? When you have done that, then you build a country. And that was one of George's feelings, that you shouldn't be buying European art. You've got to start supporting your American artists. Here again, we have another piece that is one of the permanent collections, Helen Taylor sketching by John Sloan. Again, you can make reference to this, obviously done in the same time period, but just go to your notes on your permanent collection here if you feel you want to talk about it. I think it's wonderful that we've integrated a lot of the pieces from the Everson into this show, but if your thread that you're pulling through this is Edward Root's collection. He was born in Italy. He was educated in Carrara, which all of you have probably heard of Carrara because that's where Michelangelo used to get his marble. Carrara, we see a lot of Carrara marble here as well. Especially now with all these new kitchens being done, a lot of Carrara marble coming in. He also, when he comes back to America, when he does come here, he also does go to school under the tutelage of Robert Henry. So again, we're seeing another person who's going to be influenced by the Ashcan school. The one thing that Robert Henry says to him is, paint what you know. Paint your own experiences. And that's exactly what he does here. And this is probably one of this time period. This is done in 1937. This was one of the time periods in which artwork was starting to take a new look. And Edward Root said that he really loved this piece. There was something about this piece that he felt a real attraction to. He felt that that the artist was so sensitive to the woman, the color of her skin, the sweetness of her look, the softness of the entire composition, and the comfort of the young man as he sort of leans in. And here we have a table which, perspectively is really kind of tipped upward. But look at how it really serves as that oblique angle, like I showed you in the portrait. It brings you into the composition. It's a very shallow composition. There's not a lot of space from foreground to background, but it lends you the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, even in that compressed space, so that you get a feeling of depth. Take a look at and study Asian art as well as art from Persia. And what we see here is truly the kind of perspective that we would often see in Asian art. That high horizon line. The stacking of perspective and things that don't overlap. Do you notice how none of the signs would overlap each other? None of the buildings overlap each other. We know that this is distance because it's going farther away up on the composition, not because there's that horizon line with a vanishing point that's bringing you to a vanishing point. The perspective is truly far more of an Asian perspective than what we would typically see in the United States. What we would also want to note is his coloration. Obviously, what we see in his work, in Preston's work, is a lot of the ideas of using complementary colors. We have these reds that complement these greens. We have sort of these indigo colors, which are purpley blue, that complement sort of these goldish colors. Again, bringing some excitement to the composition that could be rather stagnant. It's simply hills and sort of these zigzag switchbacks kinds of composition. We have, obviously, he's very interested in showing you city life, urban life. And he was very interested in this poured concrete kind of architecture at that time, which was kind of new to that time period. So you have that kind of poured concrete architecture over here. We have the rolling hills that bring us down, and then we have these wonderful little blotches of bright color to keep it exciting. Very, very influenced by, like I said, Persian art as well as Asian. Also very involved not only with the figural end of it, but also the idea of the city. His style is described, like I said, as social realism, but he celebrated New York City. He loved the culture of New York City. He loved it from, obviously, the vaudeville areas, the bums what was that called? Where did the bums used to hang out? Bowers. Thank you. I just couldn't think of that word. Hanging out and about. He loved it all, but he truly loved the harbors. And the harbors were very, very he would trek all over the city. He would be on the subways. He would be on these tugboats. And one of the things about Reginald Marsh that's pretty exciting is that he was also very involved in the fact of all that fine detail. Because if you take a look at this little tugboat, you can see even the deck chairs on it. I mean, every single little detail was important to him. He places you, the viewer, in the same place as the tugboat. You're out in the water. You're not on shore looking out at the tugboat. You're out in the water looking at it. So that you're feeling that same kind of, rocking of the waves. You're looking at the skyline, and you're really feeling what the tugboat's feeling. The choppy water, the churning clouds, all of it is just giving you that feeling of the excitement of the city, which Reginald Marsh was very, very attached to, the excitement of New York City. Because he was a confirmed draftsman, he preferred to use tempera paper often because he liked to be able to have faster drying paint, and he wanted to use smaller brushes because he loved all that little tiny detail. Root receives an inheritance during the time period when this was bought, and in the 3 years, really, I talked to Karen about it, and I talked about his pieces, and the incandescence of the light bulbs that they put in any of the lights that are coming towards here are different than the others because these are watercolors. And that was one thing that Birchfield said. He was often annoyed that people were hesitant to want to buy a watercolor or to put a watercolor into their museums because watercolors will fade. They will fade versus an oil painting. But he said if properly lit and if properly handled, there's no reason that they can't stay as vibrant as they should be. And so what the Everson Museum has done is something to please, obviously, any watercolorist, and Mr. Birchfield would be happy to know that Karen made that consideration so that his paintings will be seen beautifully, but protected as well. This is his piece called Dead Sunflower, and this is one of the pieces that he did during his mania. Remember when I talked to you about it? Grain fever is what they called it back then. And the mania was that he would walk to work every single day and walk home for lunch and then walk back to work and sketch, all the while he was doing that because he was obsessed with drawing and then painting every flowering plant in his world. This could be seen right from his own room in his house. When he'd come home after doing all of that sketching during the day, he would paint during the night. He did this 1 year after the mania started. This was done in 1916, so this was done right in the beginning of his time right out of college. So this is one of his first pieces. And I think that if you take a look at it, you can still see some of the pencil marks in it, which I think is wonderful because it really relates to the idea of sketching. Also remember that Birchfield always did his watercolors on an easel, which is unlike most watercolors. Now, gouache does have more of a thick way of, its emulsion is much thicker. But you can see that he doesn't use a thick paint in this case. You still see those washes, but he used more what was called a dry brush technique. That's when you would put your brush into the water and into the paint, and then you would pat it, maybe like on a paper towel or a cloth, and get most of the moisture out, and then work it in, work the paint in, so it wouldn't just keep dripping on you. Otherwise, you couldn't work with an easel. Like I said, by the next year, after he made this commitment to painting all of these pieces of plant life in his area, he does create this particular piece in 1917. He thought he would be a nature writer. He thought that he would write about nature, but instead he became a painter, and as a result, oftentimes he would make inscriptions on the back of his watercolor paintings and talk about what he felt about nature itself. So he did have quite a big commitment to nature, and as you can imagine, someone like Ruth would be very interested in his work. And Edward and Joe would go to Cape Cod for 40 years in the summers and spend their summers there. He wasn't crazy about the landscape there. It was too soft of a landscape, he said, too hilly, too rolly. But what he loved was the light, because the light could play on these rolling hills, and and then he could have his way with all the shadows and the highlights and the coloration. Now something like this piece, I think could become visually boring, because really you've got blue and you've got green, and that's about it. But it's all these wonderful textural changes that he makes in his painting, all these deep shadows and all those beautiful lights that he brings in some really golden colors. And then he also shows you the softness of the hills, and he gives you sort of an impasto in some of the upper areas when you start to look at some of his work, which we haven't seen in most of the paintings thus far. We haven't seen that thicker applications of paint. You start to see Edward Hopper really starting to bring that onto his canvases. He's known for his particular attention to the geometry, but yet stays within the realism of the piece. He again was a person who made a lot of preparatory sketches. And he is known to be a soft realist, okay, where he simplifies the shapes and the details, and he uses saturated color to accent that highlight and the contrast between dark and light. Root praised Hopper's work, like I told you before, by saying that he had three purely formal motives: sparkle and color, which we see here, mass, which we obviously can witness here, and space. And those three things really appealed. That very basic formal properties of art were in his work. Crazy about the landscape there. It was too soft of a landscape, he said, too hilly, too rolly. But what he loved was the light, because the light could play on these rolling hills, and then he could have his way with all the shadows and the highlights and the coloration. Now something like this piece, I think, could become visually boring, because really you've got blue and you've got green, and that's about it. But it's all these wonderful textural changes that he makes in his painting, all these deep shadows and all those beautiful lights that he brings in some really golden colors. And then he also shows you the softness of the hills, and he gives you sort of an impasto in some of the upper areas when you start to look at some of his work, which we haven't seen in most of the paintings thus far. We haven't seen that thicker applications of paint. You start to see Edward Hopper really starting to bring that onto his canvases. He's known for his particular attention to the geometry, but yet stays within the realism of the piece. He again was a person who made a lot of preparatory sketches. And he is known to be a soft realist, okay, where he simplifies the shapes and the details, and he uses saturated color to accent that highlight and the contrast between dark and light. Root praised Hopper's work, like I told you before, by saying that he had three purely formal motives: sparkle and color, which we see here, mass, which we obviously can witness here, and space. And those three things really appealed. That very basic formal properties of art were in his work. Psychological distinctions. I can't tell you about Texas women on any of these, or that she had stabbed in her hands, or she said, "Hello, sucker." Those things didn't happen here. But we know that our Morton's mother died of starvation in his arms, and his wife left him when he was in his lowest point in his life, and he committed suicide. When you stand next to this painting, and you know that the neighborhood is making the calendar, think of how he changed his name. Think of how he changed his birthday. Think about how his wife broke his heart, and that his children were taken, and he had cancer, and he broke his arm that he painted with, and his studio burned down. And he painted this only months before he committed suicide. Psychological distinctions. I can't tell you about Texas women on any of these, or that she had stabbed in her hands, or she said, "Hello, sucker." Those things didn't happen here. But we know that our Morton's mother died of starvation in his arms, and his wife left him when he was in his lowest point in his life, and he committed suicide. When you stand next to this painting, and you know that the neighborhood is making the calendar, think of how he changed his name. Think of how he changed his birthday. Think about how his wife broke his heart, and that his children were taken, and he had cancer, and he broke his arm that he painted with, and his studio burned down. And he painted this only months before he committed suicide. And when he described what he did in this, he said, "I painted my life. This is my life. This is his life. Look at this. To me, like a mouth of a starving person with the lines that are just dripping over it. I see figures that look like the bones that are here. Is that what they are? I don't know. Our shield worker didn't tell me that, but I know what he went through, and I know that this is the pain that he felt. How can I tell you anything more than who he was and how he lived and what he went through? And when you stand before this painting, it no longer becomes, here's the axis line, here's the complementary colors, here's the balance. It's, here's this man's pain. And he took his tragedy and he made a composition that's visually beautiful. He gave us beauty from his tragedy. And he said that we should never walk away from a piece of art where we found it comedic, like marshes. We shouldn't walk away with a story, because what we have to do is we have to just walk away with the love of what it was. And that's our shield work. And that is someone like Bezoit, who read the poetry of Baudelaire and felt inspired by those words. And I read to you that poem about cats, and here it is. People will question, what is this orb? Why is that eye? What is this animal? What are these things? But you have to get to know Bezoit. You have to get to know him, that he loved this poetry. And this poetry just radiates out of him, and he puts it onto this piece. And the same love that he has for that poem starts to become this abstracted love that he has on this canvas. Take a look at the lines of this. Remember we talked about this wood? This terrible wood that was being eaten up by worms, that it was perfect for frames because it was cheap. That's because those are the kinds of things that the artists could afford at the time. If we take a look at someone like Theodore Stamps, you can see that Theodore, if it were not for Edward Root, maybe we wouldn't even be talking about Theodore Stamps, because he's the one who ended up in that terrible lawsuit because of Rothko's estate. But why did Root go to his studio? And these paintings were stacked up against the wall, unsold, one painting done after another. And he would come in and he would sit down on the floor and just go through the paintings and walk away with 4 or 5 of them that he would buy at once. How we feel about it inside does not have to be taken with Kodak film or a selfie. It's going to be taken from what's inside, and then you're giving this to the world afterward. You're giving them something to feel again. The one piece I kind of walk by too quickly, and I'm just going to talk 2 seconds about is this piece by Kunoshi. This, I think, is important to know. Remember, he was going through the Tolkien Prize of Sea, and I was talking to you about his Asian influence. What's nice about this is take a look at the perspective. This is where he really started embracing American ideas in terms of how to create art. And one of the things that really pops out at you is look at this landscape. He went out to the southwest and fell in love with ghost towns. And that's what these are. He couldn't get over that you could still see structures that were still standing since the 1800s. And those great, and if anybody's been in the Southwest, you know what I mean when I say big sky and big earth. Because the sky goes on forever, and so does the earth. And that's what he tries to show you all around him. The accidents with this was his dad. He comes to America and he loves New York City. It was exciting, but it was awesome. It was kind of a little scary. It was confusing, and yet he had so much promise. And all of that mixed together brought out this. This is called honky-tonk. He was truly amazed with the idea of jazz. And so this was supposed to be sort of his way of expressing that idea of music. The compartmentalized kind of New York, but yet all the excitement and movement and sound and energy that came from the city. Sure, the cities were all these, very straight roads and the geometry of the way Mondrian saw New York City, but he takes it and he goes that step forward. I mean, to me, this is like the night when you're going over the Tappan Zee Bridge and you see the trestle of the bridge. I mean, this is all in one. To me, all of this is just shouting New York. It's giving you the energy, it's giving you part of the idea of the landscape, but most of all, it's giving you Jimmy Ernst's feeling about New York. Jackson Pollock. The man who was part of the drip. Not necessarily the inventor of. He has his little nest of lines. And then he relates them by the way he has this beautiful work of black, the motion of the black. He was almost like a dancer with his paint. Remember, he used it from his hand, like the sand painters of the Southwest. He also has a great advantage with any of us who paint. You have the one and only way of applying your paint if you're doing it on an easel, where you're working with it vertically, and you have a top and you have a bottom. Nothing was top, nothing was bottom, because he was working with it on the floor and could walk all the way around it. So he has a whole different way of applying paint, and the movement of the paint is going to be really unique because of the way he's applying it. Another thing he does is very conscious of the ideas of what color can do and what these lines can do. These little nests of smaller lines are being unified because he's bringing them through this axis with all of this deep black. Then he starts picking up some of the silvers and the reds to kind of pop you some wonderful blended areas just by the drip and the blending of the paint naturally. And all we can see here is his movement of his arm, the movement of his body, and the placement of the piece on the floor as he approaches this as a piece of artwork. That he rejected the whole idea of being an American scene painter, and his effort was to respond emotionally to sensations and ideas that originated within himself. He used those ideas of Mondrian, but he also wanted to give you more information. He didn't want to make a picture of what he saw outside of himself, but instead he wanted you to see a picture of what he felt inside of himself. So he embraced Cubism, he embraced the idea of geometric abstractionism, and a lot of people would say, the idea that it's marine variation, that this could be considered like the water. You could see these almost as perhaps boats, maybe piers. I mean, if you wanted to bring some real description into it, you can see he gives you a few more visual clues than someone like Mondrian. Just to be considered as something that has been brought to you that is geometrically pleasing to the eye, the colors are exciting, there's movement in the shapes. Again, what was inside, what it would be like to be in a park, the excitement inside of him, the colors, the little tiny, here you can see like little branches. There are some glimpses of reality there, but most of it is the extracted part of the park, the experience and what he saw in a less detailed format. I mean, here this is supposed to be no feather pillow. This could be a landscape of outdoors, like as if you were looking down at the ground where there's grass around a muddy piece. But do you know what I'm saying? You can bring from this anything you want to. It's just something that visually is pleasing. It has energy. It has warmth to it. It has softness to it. Summer orchard. This reminds me almost like sea meatballs. Yeah, I mean, these are the things that Arthur Dove By giving young people, and even the adults in our community, an understanding and a love for this. The abstractions are the ones that are going to keep bringing us to the future, because when you walk out the door, you'll see this in your life. And people will start to understand their own visions and their own interpretations of what's around them, and not wait for someone to give them to them. That is the intellectual imperative. You have made an investment of people not just enjoying